And it's all yours, Kate. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Carrie, thanks so much for having me and for that lovely introduction. And I'm so excited to see so many folks here today and all the inspiration that you are getting. And of course, new lunch with coworkers, also really exciting. But as Carrie mentioned, so feel free to put things in the chat as we go today and stop me for questions or comments. I'd love to engage as we're going. And I'm gonna start sharing my screen so that you can see I've got a slide deck and some resources that I believe, Carrie, you sent out to folks last night. And then if we end up talking about any more, which sometimes happens, we can, oh, my computer is going a little slow. There we go. I can send out those resources to you, Carrie, to again share with everybody else if there's any additional pieces. So we've got some things in the chat. I'm going to just kick it off by introducing myself a little bit so you know a little bit about my background. I'm an assistant professor of special education at University of Maine, Farmington. I used to be a high school educator, special education, and really I did a lot of work as an inclusion facilitator for students with the most complex support needs in high school setting. As Carrie mentioned, I love to work with families and support individual teams and students to really succeed in inclusive settings. I've written a couple of books, one about really supporting students with challenging behavior, because we know that that can be something that can be really exclusionary for students as well. Although I know today we're focusing on academics, and that is a real favorite specialty of mine. And then I've also written the Paraprofessionals Handbook for Inclusive Support with my dear friend and colleague, Julie Costin. Some of you may know her and have followed her work. And so I'm going to pull on some of these ideas for our time today. I also have some photos of my family on here because I figured it's fun to show that. If you see anything that you are like, oh, that's the same as me, like I love lakes or I go on canoes, you can say in the chat, it's me. I've got a just over 1-year-old son, Sam, who is in that photo there. And he sometimes makes his way into my thinking about students these days. So if he pops up into our conversation today, that's because he's often on my mind. So let's move on to just some things about our time today. I know we've got 60 minutes together. And for somebody who spends all of her time thinking about inclusive access and thinking about academic success for students with disabilities, I know that in 60 minutes, we can try to cover a lot. So for what I'd love you to do is think about how can I capture some of this learning from today so that I can return to it, that I can think through it, that I can reach out to Kate or Carrie or other folks in my network to think about what does it mean to me? How am I going to use it? How am I going to connect to colleagues, parents, etc. And what other supports might I need? So just be thinking about that. You can always screenshot stuff on Zoom, no problem. I'm going to share my PowerPoint slides with Carrie as well to post on the website, and I know that it's recorded, so those are all nice options. If we could, before we get started, type in the chat why you're joining today. Are you a parent of a child who you're wanting to increase their academic access? Are you a professional working in the field? If you could put that in the chat right now, that would be really great. And you can also share something else about yourself too, because I know I shared some about me. And I'll give you a moment to just type in the chat there. Okay, beautiful. Wonderful. So staff, professional, case manager, advocates, parents, psychologists. Folks, this is so fun. We have such a wide array of identities here. So really, really excited. Cool, cool, cool. So for our agenda today, we're going to do a little bit of an opening, which is we're going to get clear on how I'm talking about inclusion. And I think hopefully it will really fall in line with what you just heard from Dan and Sam and anybody else at this conference and things that you're thinking about in inclusion to then guide us into big ideas for creating academic access. So I know that, Carrie, this session is really thinking about when academics get in the way of inclusion. And so the way I've structured it is all of the ways that we can overcome those barriers. So 5 big ways, really. And then we will close for today. So to start, I just want you to sit back and you can read along with me. I'm going to read it out loud. This definition comes from my colleague, Julie Costin at Inclusive Schooling. And she developed it out of a 25-year career thinking about inclusive education. And some of it you may notice if you know Norman Kuntz's definition of inclusive education, some pieces might ring true from that as well. So I'm going to read it out loud. And as you're listening, just respond in the chat, things that it makes you think about, your reactions, your feelings, your questions. And so inclusive education means we no longer accept that separate classrooms, separate schools, and separate lives are in the best interest of any student. Separating people by ability disadvantages everyone. Belonging is a human need. Our educational system, practices, and spaces need to be reimagined. Inclusive education means that every student is valued because of their strengths, gifts, and even challenges, as disability is simply diversity. Everyone benefits from meaningful participation and opportunities to learn grade level content with diverse peers. We must trust that all students come to us as incredible whole people who do not need to be fixed. So take a moment and are there any pieces that strike you or impact you from this definition as you're thinking about access, whether you're providing it for students, whether you're advocating for it, belonging as a human need, Kristen? Yes. Any other pieces that come to your mind for you all from this definition? Yeah. Yeah, Felicia. So it's not just about him, but it's for other kids, it's for community. The concept of not needing to be fixed is resonating with you, Stacey and Susan. Okay, so you're thinking about Maslow's levels, like what is the human need before we can succeed or learn? How the term grade level is defined and used. Yeah, Amanda, that's a really important piece that we will talk about today. So what does grade level mean when we're talking about access and inclusion in academics for students with disabilities? So we're going to use this as our grounding understanding. And then I just want to show you that to achieve this idea in which all students belong, all students have access to grade level content where they can make progress in these pieces, there are really clear ways to achieve this type of inclusion. I spend a lot of time in schools doing research, working with educators, working with families, and these are the pieces that we know need to come together. And I've highlighted the 3 that we're going to talk about today, which is to think through eliminating barriers to access, participation, and learning. And this is really by abandoning inequitable practices, policies, and procedures. So we're going to start off with this. And then we're really thinking about differentiating to create access points. So, and how do we differentiate our content? How do we think about then providing additional support, which is that following highlight, to an enrichment for all to continuously and seamlessly provide support. And that's going to really be thinking about those adaptations that we're creating for students that are a little bit further from differentiation for our students. But if you're looking at those other pieces, which you might be, that are not highlighted, that we're not going to talk about in detail today, you can see how they all really work together. We're thinking about systems and structures that focus on belonging, diversity, inclusion. We're thinking about hiring practices. We're thinking about creating welcoming spaces. We're thinking about co-teaching and collaborating. I will touch on that today just a little bit, partnering with families, and then thinking about challenging behaviors too. And I know there's a session later today about that, so hopefully that will build on there if you're curious. Okay, so the 5 big ideas that we're going to talk about today are as follows. We're challenging the myth of too low. We're prioritizing goals and skills for the gen ed context. We're creating multiple access points. We're creating adaptations, and we're providing what we consider to be natural contextualized supports as often as possible. So when I say challenge the myth of this student is too low, real quick in the chat, have you ever heard this comment before in any context? It's too low. The academics are too low. The reading level is too low. The math writing skills are too low. Yes, yes. So Kristen says, Heidi says, yes. Jonathan says, yes. This is a really, really common phrase when we're thinking about including students with disabilities. And what I want us to pause and consider is, we have been wrong so often about whether or not a student is too low. And so instead of this, we want to challenge this in multiple ways. There are multiple ways to challenge it. So the first way to challenge it is to really think about the fact that disability is diversity. It is expected, it is known, it is a human part of our experience. And so for us to say that a student is too low to access a general education setting in which we are looking to create belonging and access, this is something that we want to significantly challenge. We also want to think about the fact that if diversity and disability go hand in hand, we're also thinking about the presumption of competence. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase before, to presume competence, and that means that we don't want to underestimate a student's ability to access content, to access grade level curriculum, to access participation with peers. And I'm gonna pause my screen share just for a moment, and just so I can see some faces and some names and things like that, because what I want to say about this is, it often looks like a huge barrier to say, this student is only reading at the second grade level. They cannot access grade level content. This student is only doing math at a third grade level. How could they possibly access grade level content in 8th grade, in 9th grade, in 10th grade? What does that presume? I'm going to ask you and put it in the chat. If we say that just because a student is reading at a particular level, or folks maybe not reading at all, maybe not decoding in any way, what does it say if we are saying that they can't do it, they can't access? What does it mean? Do you think? You can put it in the chat. It can be philosophical, it can be practical, it can connect to the definition. Okay, so there's some boxes child does not fit in, and that box is general education. Good point. It doesn't mean they can't access it via another media attack. Ooh, okay, great. Because you're thinking now about the skill of reading, the skill of math. We're not willing to change it. And Susan, I'm gonna expand on your it. And I'm thinking the change it is the way we teach, as opposed to the way that student learns, right? Stacy, assuming failure. Susan, assuming that this child is unable to do the work. Okay, and it is also assuming that they are not intellectually complex enough to take on grade level content that their peers are discussing, to take on, okay, non-academic content that their peers are discussing in class. All of these pieces, this assumes that. And so what we want to do is the opposite. We want to assume that students with disabilities, no matter how extensive, no matter how complex their support needs are, have the opportunity and the ability to take on complex intellectual understanding. And then to speak to some of your pieces, we just have to figure out how to let them access it. So this sometimes lives in this concept. Schools and systems, and those of us who work in these professional helping fields, sometimes we approach things through a medical lens, which is that the disability resides within the individual, that it's an individual pathology or impairment, and we're trying to fix it or remediate it. But if we go back to our definition earlier, we remember that we're not trying to fix our folks. We're trying to help them access content, access community, access peers, access, rich intellectual discussion, even if they're not decoding, even if they're reading at second grade level, right? So these are the pieces. And that disability labels aren't deficits. And instead, to go to, somebody said, we're not focusing on the way we teach it. So yeah, it's not the problem, it's the system, it's the structure, it's our instructional design. It's our structures that we set up to separate and sort and segregate. So if we ignore these systemic inequities, disability continues to be seen through this outdated medical lens. What we want to do is shift to this equity lens, where we're thinking about it as a socially constructed identity, where the societal barriers, like the instructional design, like the structures of our schools, are really what's disabling our folks because they can't get access to general education peers or content or curriculum or whatever new book or TikTok that the kids are talking about. And the aim is to provide not something that we're fixing or remediate, but just right support so that they can access. And as somebody said, through a different test or through a visual or through listening, right? So we're thinking about expanding the way we support students. And that also means naming and addressing inequities within our systems, within our schools, with our institutions. So this brings us a little bit to the law. Folks can say, wait, Kate, we have a continuum of services for a reason, I thought. The least restrictive environment. And what I want us to remember is the least restrictive environment is that our services of special education are given in the regular education class, the general education class, and that all of these supplementary aids and services should be delivered to them before we even consider removing a student. So that brings me to this checklist of samples of supplemental support aids and services. It's a handout that Carrie emailed to you last night that I sent out, and I'm just gonna pull it up here so you can see it. Whoop, 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 whoop. It's based on the work of Villa and Thousand, and they've sort of been adapted by us at Inclusive Schooling. And the reason I wanted to share it with you and to talk about it here as we talk about academic access is because, like I said earlier, readiness levels, skill levels, whatever it might be, is often a reason for removal from general education. And so what we want to say is, check out all of these pieces, all of these supplemental support aids and services that we can provide a student first. Have we thought about environmental support? Have we thought about pacing? Have we thought about the presentation of our subject matter? Have we thought about all the different material ways, the specialized procedures and equipment, assignment modifications, self-management and follow-through ideas, adaptations for testing, social interaction support, levels of staff support? So all of these pieces we want to try first before ever considering removal to a separate space. So you can take this, use it when you're working with students, use it when you're going to an IEP for your child, however you want to think about it. But I want us to remember that this is a really key piece of the work, because IDEA requires that we're more than just in. We want to have access, we want to be involved, we want to make progress in it, even when that access, that involvement, and that progress looks a little bit different than maybe a peer without a disability, or maybe another counterpart with a similar disability. And again, expanding our understanding that diversity and disability is expected, it's human. And so different ways to experience learning and context should be embraced. So the next piece would be that just a highlight of some of the research. Oh, sounds like someone is moving some stuff around.
If you're not Kate, can you please mute yourself while she presents? Thank you.
Thank you. So Anita, you have a question. So how do you address lack of accessibility to the environment and accompanying safety as their concerns? That's a great question. What I think we could do is we'll come back to that when we talk about adaptations and ways to think about access. Just a quick highlight here, and I want to highlight the research because sometimes we can say inclusion is great, but not for this particular student or this particular student or this particular disability label. And what I want us to remember and always share with colleagues, with schools, with families, that it benefits all students, all disability categories, including, if not more so, students with more significant disabilities, all age, all subgroups, gifted and talented, all subject areas, all outcome types. So academic, we're talking about that today, but academic, social, behavioral, communication, attendance, post-secondary, you name it, it is increased because of experiences of inclusion for students. So we can talk about access, belonging, inclusion, and we can say, yeah, sure, this student is not decoding or this student is below grade level, but how get a student to think about grade level content access, even with readiness skills that maybe don't feel like they're there yet. And this is creating priority goals and skills for the gen ed context. I want us to pause and think about the fact that sometimes we're trying to fit IEP goals and skills into the general education context. It's going to be hard to do that. How are we going to make that goal fit? How are we going to get that data taken, X, Y, Z? And instead, it is up to us to write these IEPs that allow us to create priority IEP goals and address skills that are going to help the student to access general education curriculum, that are going to help us to help a student access general education peers. So it's all up to us. What this can look like is, so first, let's start with our strengths. Again, remember, if we're going back to our definition and we're thinking that the old, outdated medical lens looks at disability as deficit only. Instead, we want to start with our students' strengths. This is a really, really, really powerful way to help create goals, skills, and access to general education. So start with strengths. You've got a resource that I shared that my colleagues and I created called Getting to Know More About You. You can use it as an educator. You can share it with your educators of your children, however you want to approach it. And you can adapt it for students who are a little bit younger, or you can use it as is, however you want to approach it. It helps us to gather information from our students' perspective and from the parents' perspective and from the educators. We can all weigh in order to create a positive student profile. Now, you're saying to me, we have an IEP, and that's true. But this really helps us put it into a really succinct place. So if you have a middle school student and they are seeing 4 different teachers, 5 different teachers in general education contexts, it's a little one pager that can really travel to all the teachers and really have a deep dive into what's going to work for that student. And it helps us use the lens, the equity lens, the positive strengths-based approach lens, to think about how to provide students with access to general education settings. So this is an example for a student named Jack. You can see that he is in 6th grade. He's going to middle school. He has benefits from visual and auditory directions, his learning style. He's got strengths and interests. He's very social. He has got friends. He enjoys tech, adaptive skiing. His academic information, you'll notice that he has not demonstrated an ability to decode. His preferred mode of access is through listening. He does respond consistently to yes and no questions, and he has demonstrated the ability to recognize numbers. In another context, this Jack might be considered too low to access 6th grade general education, but this team knows that inclusive education is the way to create greater opportunities for all students including for Jack. And so he's included in Gen Ed. This means that we've got our profile. We know that they're going to be in general education. We know that they're going to be wanting to access grade level content. So we're going to create goals and skills that connect to that. We're going to prioritize them. So how do we prioritize goals that connect to grade level content, that connect students to peers, that look to scaffold skills? This means that we're not working on counting coins in 6th grade anymore. We are scaffolding so that we can get to access what's going on in grade level 6th grade math. We might have to modify. We might have to provide different ways of access, but what we're not doing is something totally separate. We're scaffolding up to increase participation, to increase belonging, to connect to grade level content. So that's how we're thinking about this. I'm going to take Jack for an example. So remember, he's not decoding yet. He does have consistent yes, no answers. He likes to listen as a way to like take in information. He's pretty social, etc. His example priority goals and skills from his team is that he's going to increase the self-initiated communication with peers, educators, and the public. This includes expressing preferences, needs, requests, and responding to questions. He's going to increase comprehension of vocabulary associated with instructional units and topics in 6th grade. So, oh, Kat asked the question decode. What is decode? So what does decode means that they are not able to look at a word and read it. They might be able to listen to text and understand what's happening, but they can't read independently in that way. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about decoding. So we've got increasing comprehension of vocabulary associated with units and topics in 6th grade. This is really important because sometimes we can say we're working on, if a student is like Jack, not decoding, we might say they're a pre-reader, right? We need to focus on sight words. We need to focus on words that they're going to be able to learn to decode. But that does not connect to the vocabulary that kids are doing in 6th grade. So instead, what we do is we scaffold that by providing him with access through listening, through yes and no questions, through images. We're doing lots and lots of different things to help him learn those vocabulary, because remember, for many, many years, many, many decades, we've underestimated students because of their complex support needs. We want to presume and assume that Jack has an intellectually complex way to understand what's going on, even if he is not reading on his own, independently decoding. So vocabulary connected to 6th grade topics. We've also got synthesizing information. So 5 to 10 big ideas for each curricular topic. This is the idea that maybe we're prioritizing, instead of mastering everything that's going on in a unit in 6th grade, we're going to make sure that he gets 5 to 10 big ideas. And the team is going to look and they're going to collaborate together. And when I say team, I mean general educators, special educator, any related service providers that are working with Jack. And they're going to figure out, okay, what big ideas do we want all students to know? And how can Jack connect to those pieces? We're going to increase access to and use of his computer-generated voice and output device. And that means that we're going to be using it connected to general education context, academics, social interactions, etc. And then he's going to use eye gaze to select and make choices consistently. Sometimes using eye gaze to select and make choices consistently might mean that Jack is pulled from class, and we're going to do that in a separate location where he can be monitored and we can take a lot of data there. Instead, what we're doing with these priority goals is we're saying, he's going to use eye gaze to select and make choices consistently throughout the day in general education. And we're going to give him a ton of opportunities to do so, with support from an ed tech, with support from peers, with support from general and special educators, etc. So we've got his example goals. We've got access. We are presuming intellectual complexity. We are making sure vocabulary. We are making sure content. We are making sure all sorts of things are scaffolded to access grade level content. Not Jack doesn't read, so we're going to make sure that he gets picture books that have nothing to do with what 6th grade is doing. That's a no-go. We want to create multiple access points. And as educators, this is where we set the stage for creating inclusive classrooms and inclusive schools in which diversity in the way we access material, engage with material, process material, and show what we know is the norm. So that when Jack is accessing something differently and processing in a different way and maybe showing what he knows in a different way, it doesn't feel so separate because we do this in many different ways with lots of different students with and without disabilities. So let me give you 4 examples. We're going to differentiate, we're going to provide choice, we're going to use small groups, and we're going to use adults really effectively. So when we differentiate instruction, this means we can create different content goals. So everybody's going to learn this one big idea, including Jack. We're going to have another level where maybe there is a less complex content goal for some students, maybe Jack. We're going to think about differentiated materials and format of content, activities and processes, and products and assessment. Can you give me some examples of what differentiated materials, formats, activity, process, product assessment might look like in a middle school or any setting in a school? What might that look like? Examples of different materials, activities, products for our learners. Just chat as many examples as you can think of. Okay, so info versus sensory activity. Great. So some students are doing one and some students are doing another. What else? Thank you, Christine. Okay, so visual, audio, tactile. Beautiful. Some folks are going to engage with a video. Some things are going to listen to a podcast. Somebody's going to use some manipulatives or maneuver a map around. So to demonstrate what you know verbally. Great, Stacy. So some folks might be sharing verbally. Some folks might be writing. Sometimes might be creating a video. Tests, quizzes, art products, acting it out, write it, slideshow, talk it out, hands-on, community visits, right? Getting into the community, printing to read off a page rather than off a screen, depending on what's going to access for that student. So beautiful. I love all these examples. What I want us to know is that when we're doing this differentiation, we're going to create this from the get-go. So we're going to think about all of our learners, including Jack or including whatever student it is that we might be providing access to that has more complex support needs. And we are going to build in differentiation based on what we know about our students, based upon their strengths, upon their needs, upon their readiness levels, upon how they're going to access. So we're going to make sure that anything we're doing, that Jack has access to, listen to it, have support from a peer to think about eye gaze, right? Every step of the way, we're going to build in differentiated supports. So we're going to differentiate. Then we're going to provide choice. Let me give you an example about why choice is so important. And I think you all will get it pretty quickly. Imagine you have to go through the entire school day and you are told what to do, what to read, when to do it, where to sit, who to do it with, how to do it, not to do it that way, all day long. What is your motivation? Are you at a 10? Yeah, I'm so motivated for school. Are you at a 0 and you don't want to be there? Give me a 0 to 10 scale motivation. If that, Susan says, she's like, I'm on it, I'm a 0. Kristen is a 0. Right now, do you have the option to get up and stand and move around, get a drink, go to the bathroom, put your video on, put your video off? These are all little choices, but they matter to the way we operate. And there's no engagement on the student part, right, Susan? They become passive learners. Now, providing choice allows students to have more motivation, more engagement, and it builds in really beautifully with how we can differentiate support for all students. So when we do this, we're providing choice, we're giving greater access to everyone, including students with disabilities, more extensive support needs. Another way we can think about providing multiple access points is to use small groups. Small groups are amazing. They help to lower the student-to-teacher ratio. We can be more responsive to our students. We can use them to differentiate and provide different access points at different areas of small groups. But I think particularly at the middle school and the high school level, educators think we can't do centers. That's for elementary school. If we're going to use small groups, doesn't that mean you're going to take the students with disabilities out and do something separate with that small group somewhere else? Is that what you mean to use small groups? And we want to say definitely not. We want you to use small groups in really, really strategic ways. And the research shows when they're heterogeneous, when they're differentiated, when there are greater access to educators. So if we've got 15 students in our class and we've got one general education teacher and a paraprofessional or an ed tech, and then maybe we've got a related service provider pumping in to support some students, we now have 3 adults that can access small groups and provide greater support and differentiation to students. So we want to champion the use of small groups when it comes to providing access for students. And we want to use adult support to increase access. Often, for students with more extensive support needs, we assign them a one-to-one support, an ed tech, a paraprofessional, a teaching assistant, anywhere we want to use. And what we know is that instead of creating those multiple access points, prioritizing those goals and those skills to increase access to content and peers, there can be a barrier that is created if that one-to-one support is doing all of the work with the student. So we want to be thinking about how can that one-to-one person, if they are there, help to provide multiple access points for that kid, facilitate peer connections, support smaller group work, create inclusive parity. So kind of like if a related service provider is pushing in or a special education teacher is pushing in, that they're doing lots of teaching work so they don't feel just like an assistant or somebody who is sort of crawling around supporting and floating. All with the goal to fade the one-to-one support. Now, this is really, really important as it pertains to thinking about creating multiple access points, because give me a yes or a no if you have heard the idea that this kid can only be included if they have a one-to-one aid with them at all times. Yes, Susan says. Anybody else experience this? Stacy, yes. Heard that before, Kristen. And it's not always the case, of course. There are always exceptions. But often when there are students who have a lot of support needs, to be included, we say they have to have a one-to-one ed tech. And when I say we, I mean school teams. Okay, so Jonathan, only one transitioning. So we're thinking about a transition and then a fade of that one-to-one support. So that's the goal. So that's beautiful. But what we want to say is that, okay, so we've got a one-to-one support. How do we use them most effectively? We want to have them help support facilitation between peers, help support multiple access points, help support small group work, and always be aiming to fade. One teach, one make multisensory is one of my favorite ways to think about this. So
Hey, Kate, it's Carrie.
yeah.
Can I just ask a question before you move
Of
on
course.
from one-to-one
Yeah.
support? A lot of times when
Yeah.
we're working with parents, and that's one of the biggest asks is one-to-one from a parental perspective. And so a lot of times when we're working with parents, when looking at having that type of support, we talk about adding it into the IET as, support for a percentage of time or actually writing in that the support is needed for this specific area instead of just a one-to-one, because I think a lot of times from a school's perspective, when you have one-to-one, it eliminates that ed tech's ability to allow other children to participate in that child's community, as opposed to writing support as needed or support for reading or support for this percentage of time. I think it allows that ed tech the ability to sort of move around the classroom and invite other children into that student's life. What are your thoughts on that?
Carrie, I love this. So I always recommend, can you use an ed tech or a paraprofessional as a grade level support, as a classroom level support, and as you say, as needed for a one-to-one, so that they are supporting the entire class. They can be used to run those small groups that I just was talking about, which, and as you so eloquently said, Carrie, to invite the community to be part of that child's life, as opposed to set up a barrier, or what my friend Julie says is a bubble, right? A bubble around them. So I think that's a really, really great piece of advice, whether you are an educator writing in one-to-one support for a student, or you're a parent advocating an IEP for services, to use a percentage of the day. Or if we go back to the concept of priority skills and goals, maybe for ELA or reading block, a one-to-one might be really powerful support. But during social studies and during math and during science, they're floating and supporting the whole classroom. Or maybe they're not even there in the classroom because things are going really well. So I am 100% on board with that type of recommendation, Carrie. And from a school system perspective, if you are in a school system, what I always like to look for when thinking about scheduling and supports and services is, how can we provide greater material and visible consult supports for students, and not a one-to-one side-by-side support? Always is the first move. How can we think about adaptations? How can we think about using a special educator to provide material support? How can we think about a grade level or team float for a classroom paraprofessional? Always, always, always first, and then one-to-one next. So great question, Carrie. Which brings me to maybe the perfect segue, really, between the one teach, one make multisensory to the adaptations when looking at our time. Yeah, I have time to talk about this. So I don't think I gave you this handout, Carrie, but I'm going to send it to you so everybody has it. This comes from a book called 30 Days to the Co-Taught Classroom, and it's by Julie Costin and Paula Cluth, and they talk about 20 ideas for one teach, one make multisensory. And it is a really, really great way to increase multiple access points for all students in the classroom, including the student who might need a really specific support because of a disability. And it can be an ed tech that's providing the support. It can be another educator. It can be a related service provider. It could be a volunteer. It could be you, the parent, if you're in there, right? And what it does is, if somebody's teaching, you're dramatically acting it out. If someone's reading, you're mapping the story out on chart paper with visuals, or you're pulling up visual supports on the smartboard to show along what's going on. If you're doing a classroom, there's somebody else moving around and giving physical responses or writing things down so that there's a visual support in addition to the verbal discussion. Basically, it's always like, how can we provide additional access point? And my job as that additional adult in there is to be doing that work. And it is a really, really powerful way to utilize adults effectively. So the fourth idea that kind of comes next is to create adaptations. Now, adaptations, you either are really well-versed in this language or you're not sure, so I'm just going to quickly highlight it. So adaptation is the umbrella term for any change to environment, curriculum, instruction, assessment, so that a student can participate in gen ed. And it includes accommodations and modifications. Accommodations are sort of changes in how it's accessed. So if they're going to listen to it instead of read it, if they're going to type it instead of handwrite it, these type of things. And a modification is a more significant change. So we might say, we are going to take a really complex idea and we are going to make it a little more concrete. That might be a modification for a student. So change in level, content, or performance. What I want to show you about this idea is that the adaptations should always, like those priority goals and skills, look to support the students' access to general education content, help them to be more successful, increase participation in the activity, provide supports that we consider just right, as opposed to this student has Down syndrome or an intellectual disability or multiple disabilities, so clearly we're going to need to modify for them. We don't want to do that. We always want to start first by saying, can we teach it directly, just like anybody else might have access to it? If not, what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to go down some question steps, but always starting at just right, building on student strengths, skills, gifts, and abilities, and using their strengths to create access points. This is a handout that I did share with Carrie to send to you. Let's find it. Here we go. There are ways to think about environmental support adaptations, peer supports, So maybe you're rotating peer partners. You are using peers to pre-teach or reteach ideas and think through support for each other. You're thinking about pacing supports. So more time on a task, reducing time on a task, chunking into separate parts. Some of these might sound really familiar to you all as you're like, oh, I use them in my classrooms. Oh, I have them in my kids' IEP. But it goes along with the handout around supplemental supports and aids and services really nicely. So you have real clear examples to say, if you say, I want an adaptation about pacing, and then you have some to choose from that say, you know, these are some things I might really want to implement for my students or for a student in my class to create better access to the content or the peers. So 100 ways to adapt anything. I want you to take it, use it, love it, hope it's helpful. But when you're creating adaptations to support access, these are the 4 ways I like to think about it. This comes from a chapter that I wrote with Alice and Julie about creating adaptation, particularly for students with more significant support needs, because that's often where we see these barriers to academic access. It's a 4-step process. We know about their strengths, we know about their needs, we've got their priority goals in mind. Can we teach directly just the way we would normally with any other students, including the use of differentiated access and multiple supports? Let's do that. If they're gonna need more support to access, let's create an instructional adaptation. It might be a modification, it might be an accommodation. Can we use assistive technology? This is a huge one for us now, right? There's so much we can do with assistive technology for students and make it feel really seamless and natural. And then finally, if all of these things aren't gonna work to provide access that's meaningful, that lets them engage, and that helps them to access grade level content, vocabulary, ideas, peers, we might reduce a task or even omit one altogether, depending on what the priority goal is and what the priority skills are for that student. So let me give you an example of it. We're gonna come back to Jack. He's not reading via decoding independently, so he likes to listen. He can respond to yes, no questions. He uses his eye gaze and hand selection for choices through his iPad. He needs a lot of breaks and a lot of snacks. He benefits from visual and auditory directions, and he's super, super social. So these are some things we know about him, just revisiting. A day in the life. I chose math and ELA because I think these are often the 2 areas which students are excluded from the most when they have academic needs or more adaptation support needs. So let's say we're going to walk through Jack's ELA day. His class is reading The Hunger Games. We could say Jack doesn't decode, he doesn't read, so he can't be in here reading with us. And instead we say, no way, he's in class. He's doing what other students are doing. He's not going to do something separate in the back, a different worksheet that is not age appropriate. He's going to use an adapted version of the Hunger Games story online. It uses Mayor Johnson picture symbols. Some of you may be familiar with it. If you're not, I can send you a link to show you what I'm talking about. And he's got his iPad. So students, and remember, in a class that's really inclusive and differentiated, kids might be reading the book hard copy. Some kids might be listening to it via audio. Some kids might be reading along on their Chromebook where they're listening and reading. And then Jack's got his iPad. So there's lots of different ways to access this text, all with the same goal that we're looking at this general education content. We've got these standards in place. And for this particular lesson, they're thinking about characters, thoughts, and feelings throughout the story plot. The assignment is to work in pairs. They're using social media. They're going to tweet. They're going to create a Facebook page. They're going to create a Pinterest board to think about how these characters feel and change. Jack and his partner are brainstorming images. They're going to do a Pinterest board. This allows Jack's partner, they both read. Now Jack's is an adapted version. So is he going to have all of the details perhaps that his peer has around the chapter? No, but does he know the theme, the idea, the understanding of the characters? Yes, absolutely. So his partner might jot some ideas, read them aloud, allow Jack to provide yes or no, eye gaze, facial expression, point, right? All of his different modes of communication. Remember, those are priority goals for him. They respond, they figure it out, they decide on their images, they build their Pinterest board together. He is absolutely included, even though he's not decoding, even though he's using adapted material. and he's connected not only to the content, to the standards, his peers too. And he's working on his other communication goals. So we've got a really beautiful day in the life for ELA. For math, now this might seem simple, but sometimes it is just that simple, where we've got an elected version of the math modules that his class is using. His assignment is modified. So often this might look like reducing the number of the problem for him and creating a multiple choice format that he can choose the answer as opposed to have to write it out, because he's using yes or no on his eye gaze. He's got an adapted calculator and iPad, and it speaks the operations out loud as he does them. And then he uses a switch to select the correct answer out of the multiple choice. Again, he's working towards grade level content, not something much lower. He's using his goals and skills, and he's using the adaptations that are going to be really here material. His paraprofessional is nearby, but again, with the plan of always stating supports to highlight material supports, peer supports, natural supports in the environment, which is providing natural social science supports. I just wanted to highlight a couple for you as we thought about Jack's Day. So 20 ways to provide invisible or silent support. I think I shared that with you, Carrie. If I didn't, I will. But some of these are in the 100 ways to adapt. But essentially, as much as possible, how can we make access to general ed content and peers and curriculum for students as age appropriate and natural as we can? How can they be contextualized as opposed to one-to-one support, as opposed to verbal directions out loud, as opposed to stigmatizing supports that, particularly for students who are older, do not want? If you've ever worked with an older student who all of a sudden starts to shut down, refuse to do work, whatever it is, it might very well be that they are being over supported by adults. And that can be really challenging for kids any age, but particularly middle school and high school, as they are working extra hard to figure out their sense of belonging, their place in the world, their place in the community. So providing material models, using peers. I like hiding in plain sight, right? So this is just an idea. If we're thinking about, can you turn your camera off if you're doing virtual support? Can you go in another area of the classroom and support other students while also thinking about what that student might need? Creating material in advance, reducing work, providing technology support. So I know, wow, it's 2:28. We're doing really well on time. These ideas, I'm going to pause now. So we've got challenge the too low myth. We do not want to underestimate the intellectual complexity of our students. We want to prioritize goals and skills to address the general education context. We create the IEP, let's make it work for general education. Let's make it work for the context. Let's make it work for scaffolding the skills. We want to create multiple access points as a baseline. Let's create the most beautiful, differentiated, tiered levels of support for all students, so that when we are providing different access points and creating adaptations for students with disabilities or students with more complex support needs, it feels like a natural extension of this work for us and for the students. We're providing natural or silent support as often as possible, which connects to Carrie's point earlier about how do we fade one-to-one adult support by using it really strategically, by thinking about providing potential support, peer support, material support. I want you all to take a moment, because we just did a lot of learning, a lot of listening. What are some things right now that you are thinking about our time today? It could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a question, it could be an inspiration.
So Kate, we did have a couple questions around the same subject matter, and that's around staffing when talking about one-to-one or just ed tech support for access.
Okay, what's the question?
And that being a challenge, because as we know right now, there's a huge worker shortage, and in response, a lot of our schools are understaffed, and how to get creative in that model.
So my immediate response, folks, is to say, do we need a one-to-one? We might not. We probably don't. We might. Some students need health supports and physical supports and a one-to-one to be around. But again, can you use it strategically where they're only around for lunchtime or they're only around for bathroom time? And most of the rest of the time, they're using educator support, peer support. Now, I know that right now we are in a crisis of staffing, exacerbated by a long pandemic road. And so these things are, I would say, almost an opportunity to rethink the way we staff and support. So might we, instead of using many one-to-ones, create a consult that special education teachers are freed up to support a grade level 6th grade team and push in and collaborate and co-teach. And then paraprofessionals, maybe there were 3 one-to-ones supporting that special education teacher in that classroom, all clustered. Now they are supporting in general education settings as classroom floats. So there are a lot of ways to get creative. And I would say that that goes back to, if you were thinking, you don't have it memorized like I do, but the idea of restructuring systems as part of inclusive education, that's a part of it. We have to think about, how are we scheduling? How are we utilizing our staff? Are they working in separate spaces? Are they clustered away from general education? How can we free them up to support in inclusive collaborative ways? That's the best advice. And I know that if you're working in a school system, these are conversations you can have. If you're a parent, you can bring these ideas to the table. I'm not saying that we can snap our fingers and restructure schools just because our staffing is low and there's this possibility that it could work. But we want to start having these conversations. How are we systemically creating inequities for students because we are staffing based on separate spaces, based on one-to-one support needs? I'm just trying to think. I don't know if you all have time. Do you want to see the way, when I work with a district or a school system or a school building even, to think through inclusive staffing structures redesign? Would that be interesting to you all, or is that just like too much at this moment? Give me a yes in the chat, or a heck yes in the chat,
just being aware of time. I know we're giving Kate some extra time because we gave Dan an extra half hour, which put us back to back. But our next session does start at 2:45, so that's fine. We can go over. I just know that we do have the hard stop at 2:45.
Okay,
so
perfect.
So just being a timekeeper a bit today.
I love it. I need it, Carrie, because otherwise I'm like, let's dive into the restructuring research, which
and then
do.
But also, Kate, if that's something that if you have any literature documentation on, we can add, you can tap into it a bit, but it's probably tip of the iceberg right now that you'll be able to get into. But if you have any resources that you want to send my way, we will add it to our website with the video.
Totally.
As well.
Okay,
and then there was another question that just popped up that I'm thinking about differentiation and want to learn more about how to get better with this. What do you recommend? Oops, I went back down. Sorry.
So improving in that area, I think that that's a really great question. I have, there's a lot of wonderful books and resources that I like to use. There are some online courses that you can take. There are some cool things to watch on TeacherTube and things like that to sort of see what it looks like in action. But I would say, Joey and anybody else who's really interested, what I could do is I have a handout packet essentially that I've created with my colleagues at Inclusive Schooling that highlight 5 really user-friendly, speaking as a teacher, differentiation strategies that you can use. We've created examples so you can sort of see what they look like. And those ideas are creating choice menus basically for students, creating think-tac-toes and using a couple of other pieces that we've built on Carol Ann Tomlinson's work, who is sort of the differentiation guru. So definitely look into Tomlinson's books and ideas. But in terms of just like immediate, what can I give you? I'll give you that handout packet that I think is a really, really great place to start. I would also recommend gathering colleagues that are interested in the work or who were already doing the work and creating a professional learning community where you're sharing resources, you're looking at each other's lesson plans, you're thinking through how to do it. It's a really, really powerful way to collectively grow your ideas and get a bunch of strategies from teachers all over. Oh, thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so that's also the website for inclusive schooling right there. Any other questions? And I won't bring up the redesign restructure, but I will tell you that we have a lot of resources about that. If you're interested, I'll share a couple of pieces with Carrie, and also know that we are in the process of writing a really practical handbook for leaders and inclusive education folks who want to create reform, essentially, in the way their structures and systems are set up. And that's going to be out with ASCD later this year. So I'll holler when it's out to Carrie, and she can share with the community here.
Sounds great. Yeah, and anything you pass on, Kate, after the session, like I said, we will put it up on our website. We're hoping to have all the recordings up on the website by the end of this week. Although it is Wednesday already, but at least by the beginning of next week, and we will add the materials, like everything that Kate already sent, which I sent out to everybody who registered for this webinar, but anything additional that you send to me, Kate, we'll attach it right to our website for anybody to be able to download.
Great.
And I will just add that I did mention, I want to be clear about the recordings. Dan and Samuel, our agreement doesn't allow it to put us up on the website, but if anybody's interested in seeing that, it was recorded, albeit I got to it about 5 minutes late because I was so excited to have Dan and Sam with us. I forgot to hit the record button.
Of course.
But I have that link available and I can send it to anybody who emails us at Maine Parent Federation. We'll send that out. But I mean, Kate, you were the perfect sort of follower for Dan and Samuel. All this information is incredibly helpful for parents and teachers alike. Whether you're advocating for your child or you're a teacher who's working with these students on a regular basis, it's all very helpful hints. And I know Kate has been implemental in Sammy's instruction in her school. And so it's been great having her on board. And when I thought about doing this conference, she was one of the first presenters that came to mind because academics, especially in those older years, can become a barrier, and it's really about breaking down those barriers and using all the supports in place. And as the parent, thinking outside the box and helping your school to think outside the box. And Kate brings that to the table, and Sammy's planning as well. So I'm not seeing any other. Go ahead, Kate.
Oh, no, Carrie, I just want to say, because I think it is powerful that Sammy's team has created a lot of really exciting new opportunities to support in general education using differentiation and thinking about adaptations over the last couple of years. And it's cool to see as that growth can happen and in real time.
Yeah, I agree. And then hopefully once it happens in real time for one student, the door is ajar for the other students following behind. That's the idea.
The ripple effect is absolutely real. So I want to thank you all. If you want to leave a word about your thoughts for our time together, I invite you to put it in the chat. It could be a word, a phrase, but I like to end with everybody's collective thoughts. If you want to go ahead and do that in the chat. Bye, folks.
And thank you for joining us, Kate, and spending time with us. Our next session to start at 2:45, and it'll be Courtney Angelosante talking about behaviors and inclusion. So, and some great words being shared in the chat box about this session. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you in a few.
Thanks all, and hi, Anita. Hi, Max.